Welcome to the second episode of Our Vices, a short program where we specifically focus on each vice president's time in office, how they reached that position, and what, if any, legacy they left behind. So let's begin. How did Thomas Jefferson become our second vice president? Born in Virginia in 1743 to a wealthy slaveholding family, he attended William and Mary College. He was admitted to the VA bar in 1767. By 1769, he was serving in the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was their legislature, and at this time the lower house of a bicameral legislature. In 1775, Jefferson was appointed as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, which in 1776 appointed him to the Committee of Five, tasked with writing the Declaration of Independence. John Adams insisted that the actual writing of the document come from Jefferson. The committee believed Jefferson to be well-liked among Southern revolutionaries, a great writer, and that the Declaration should be inked by a Virginian, the oldest and largest in population of the 13 colonies. In 1779, Jefferson became the Revolutionary Governor of Virginia, not one of his standout moments, and he moved on by appointment of the Confederate Congress, that's the national body we had under the Articles of Confederation, to become our Minister to France in 1784. An important position considering that France and the United Kingdom made up much of the transatlantic world wherein our young country would have to survive. In 1789, under the new Constitution, Jefferson's experience earned him the appointment to be our very first Secretary of State as part of Washington's cabinet. Jefferson took his appointment in 1790 and quickly found out that there existed a large political gulf between himself and other members of the cabinet, specifically Alexander Hamilton. As the first Secretary of the Treasury, he envisioned a national bank, which Jefferson, as a Southern planter, saw as a way to indent landowners to bankers, embolden the merchant-dominated cities, and subjugate the country. Hamilton would become the leader of the emerging Federalist Party. Jefferson, a leader of what historians now call the Democratic-Republican Party. Just starting out during Washington's presidency, the Democratic-Republicans could be referred to as the Anti-Administration Party, being defined by their opposition to the Federalists. Then they were called Republicans, and eventually, just to underscore the importance of Jefferson, you might hear them referred to as Jeffersonians or Jeffersonian Republicans. I digress. In cabinet meetings, Hamilton's grand scheme appeared to Jefferson and others of his party to be essentially rebuilding the United States on the British model, creating the very same hierarchy we had cast away in the Revolution. Many in Washington's cabinet followed Hamilton, and Jefferson found it difficult to maintain civil discourse and debate without conversations devolving into personal arguments. Jefferson saw these conflicts as a microcosm of the politics of the nation as a whole and believed Washington should seek a second term, as he was the only force holding together a fragile nation. With the outbreak of war between France and Britain in 1793, Jefferson fell firmly on the side of supporting the French, the Hamiltonians, the British, while the president and vice president preferred neutrality. By the end of the year, Jefferson had resigned as Secretary of State. This allowed him to distance himself from the actions of the president's cabinet and focus his energies on working with fellow Virginian James Madison to build a stronger Democratic-Republican Party for the upcoming 1796 election. At the time, each elector had 2 votes, both cast for a presidential candidate. The second-place winner of the total electoral vote would become vice president. Wouldn't be until the 12th Amendment that one of the electors' votes would be earmarked as a vice president vote. Understanding this, James Madison suggested that Jefferson run for president in 1796. Jefferson liked the idea and at the time preferred being the vice president as it came with less duties and he could spend more time at home in Virginia. Also, Jefferson didn't mind the idea of being vice president to John Adams, as the two, despite their political differences, had long been friends, and John Adams, despite being identified as a Federalist, was no friend of Hamilton. Also at the time, there was a recognition of rank in politics. Jefferson considered Adams his senior, in age certainly, but also in experience. The 1796 election will sound very foreign to modern ears. The actual candidates did not campaign for themselves. Such a thing was unseemly. Their supporters did so for them. Also, as mentioned before, those intending to be president or vice president were all competing for the same basket of electoral votes. As such, 13 different people received some amount of the electorate. John Adams came in first with 71 votes, with no help from Hamilton, who nearly cost him the election by allegedly siphoning Federalist votes to Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina, while simultaneously trying to hurt Jefferson with Pinckney's appeal to Democratic Republicans. Whatever the exact details, Hamilton's plan backfired. Jefferson came in second with 68 votes, just 4 of beating Adams outright. Which brings us to our second question. What did Jefferson accomplish while vice president? There was some optimism about an Adams-Jefferson presidency and vice presidency. Many thought it would be good practice to have both emerging parties represented. Also, the North-South balance established by Washington from Virginia and Adams from Massachusetts would be maintained. The day before inauguration, President-elect Adams asks Jefferson to lead a diplomatic mission to France, as the French seizure of American ships nearly had us on the brink of war. Jefferson, very outwardly pro-French and our former minister to France, was a perfect and perhaps the best pick. However, this move by Adams can also be seen as a way to distract a rival, to send him to another nation, get him out of the political zeitgeist of the country. Either way, Jefferson politely declines, citing his duties as presiding officer of the Senate, and claiming that the vice presidency was more part of the legislative branch. To undertake this mission would be, on his part, improper. Adams concurred. Now, Jefferson claims in his later recollections that this was the last time Adams ever consulted him as vice president, Jefferson himself making it clear he was not to play a role in the executive branch. This distancing would allow him to disown the actions of the president in the future election. The important outcome of this delegation that did go to France was the XYZ affair, which only pushed our two nations closer to war. Had Jefferson accepted the mission, perhaps the agents X, Y, and Z would have been deterred from trying to extract a bribe from our sitting vice president, friend of the French, and one of the major figures consulted in the drafting of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. Anyway, while VP, Jefferson opposed Adams' decision to open up trade with Haiti. As you may know, the nation of Haiti was born out of a slave revolt that turned into a revolution, ousting Jefferson's friends, the French, once again. More intimately, the incredible success of a slave revolt was not something the slave-owning Jefferson wanted to publicize, promote, or otherwise legitimize, and again, move us closer to a war with the French. The Northern Federalists, however, saw Haiti as another market in which the merchant class could trade with, and their goods would be to the benefit of all. On the executive side of things, Adams retained Washington's cabinet, which meant Hamilton's followers were still in the mix. Jefferson came to question if Hamilton had won over the independent nature of Adams, who he had previously believed too principled to be moved by Hamilton. Jefferson and his supporters came to see Adams as a monarchist who spent too much time in the court of King George III. While the cabinet mulled over ideas concerning standing armies and centralized banking, and even occasionally the whiff or suggestion of some sort of hereditary position, such thoughts worried the Democratic Republicans. Adams, to his credit, began purging Hamilton's bunch from his cabinet and easing tensions with France. Jefferson, on his part, urges French officials to receive American diplomats, but he tells the French officials to drag out the proceedings as long as possible, as Adams would not be president forever. Curious moment here. This appears to me to be at least in the arena of conspiring with a foreign government. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't intend to step in it at present, just floating the thought out there. Tell me what you think. I don't have an answer. Jefferson found, other than his tie-breaking votes, his role in the Senate was limited and undefined. He went about writing a manual, using the procedures of British Parliament as a model, as to how a legislative body should be run in its day-to-day operations. That would become quite influential. Jefferson presided over the passing of the Sedition Act, which on the surface was to censor publications that made false statements about the US government. In reality, it targeted the Democratic Republican publications critical of the Federalists' Adams administration. Adams and his party saw criticism of the government as emanating from foreign French influence, which also led to the two Alien Acts. Jefferson saw this as a clear overreach of power to stifle opposition at the expense of free speech. From his position as vice president, he could do nothing about this, except to try to craft a new legal attack that may withstand constitutional scrutiny. Jefferson anonymously crafted a resolution that appeared in the Kentucky legislature and had Madison do his own resolution that went through the Virginia legislature. Jefferson's resolution declared the Sedition Act void and of no force. Kentucky passed the resolution in what they believed would be the first successful attempt to nullify a federal law, finding that the law violates the Constitution. By taking this path, Jefferson forced these new laws to become a national debate that most of the states felt compelled to weigh in on. Beside the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, 7 other states debated supporting or opposing the resolutions in their own legislature. 3 states eventually passed a resolution in opposition to Kentucky and Virginia. At this point, it goes without saying, Adams and Jefferson, old friends and revolutionaries, were on opposite ends of the political chasm. Jefferson made it clear to his supporters he would seek the presidency in the year 1800. This election cycle would pit President Adams against his own vice president, who had spent his entire term undermining the president and his party and using his position to quietly display almost a shadow government in the parliamentary style, showing people what could be. Coming the campaign season, Jefferson retired to Virginia in proper keeping of a gentleman up for office, but along with Madison wrote extensively to supporters, organizing the Democratic Republicans like no American party before, taking a national view and drumming up support on a state-by-state basis. Jefferson was convinced momentum was on his side and that the Federalists were a party on the wane. However, Jefferson would not chance his election on presumption. Jefferson paid a writer by the name of James Callender to be his most bombastic propagandist. At one point, Callender describes Adams' character and decision-making as hermaphroditical. Adams, by comparison, thought himself like Washington above political parties, and spent much of his time criticizing and otherwise alienating the Hamilton wing of the Federalist Party. Adams did not campaign like Jefferson, but also didn't embrace his party, nor do the kind of electioneering Jefferson would do. Adams believed Jefferson's Republican views were somewhat diminished by the turn the French Revolution had taken, and that if Adams were to win a second term, it should be on the merit of his first term, not the machinations of politics. Hamilton and other Federalists would do the work of attacking Jefferson anyway, some seeing Jefferson as a traitor for his love of the French, which again I asked, did he conspire with the foreign government? You tell me. Adams faced his own accusations of loyalty when he advised a federal judge to extradite Jonathan Robbins, a British mutineer, back to the United Kingdom for certain execution. The Republican press claimed Robbins was an American impressed into the British Navy and not a British citizen, shading his action during the mutiny as those of a revolutionary. The exact details are still debated to this day. Adams' advisement was seen by some as an executive overreach into the judicial branch, and the act of a quisling bowing to British might. Jefferson later credits this incident as the most impactful single event that hurt Adams' chances of a re-election. What also did not help Adams was the ongoing quasi-war with France, which conveniently was resolved in September of 1800, not coming into effect until 1801, and served to gain Adams no discernible popularity. Remember that thing Jefferson wrote to that French diplomat about pushing... Never mind. What may have been more impactful was Alexander Hamilton's support again for Charles Pinckney, and of course the 3/5 rule, which gave the South more electoral votes on the backs of their own slaves. Come election time, Adams receives 65 votes, Pinckney 64 votes. However, both Adams and Aaron Burr received 73 votes. The Democratic Republicans intended for Burr to be their vice presidential pick, but took no certain measures to ensure he would receive less votes than Jefferson. The resolution to this belongs in our next episode on Vice President Burr, because anyone who owns a nickel knows Jefferson becomes our third president. Which brings us to our last segment. What legacy did Jefferson create during his time as vice president? Number 1, Jefferson's own presidency, his many accomplishments in that role, and the ascendancy of his party to national dominance, which would only later be rivaled by the Jacksonian Democrats who themselves claimed to be the inheritors of the old Jeffersonian ways. In fact, it wasn't until the rise of the Whig Party to national dominance in the 1840s that the memory of Jefferson somewhat receded from political identity. Number 2. Jefferson further established the separate nature of the legislative and executive branch by not taking on the diplomatic mission to France, which may have averted the XYZ affair. Later, Jefferson continued to enforce the separation of powers by not making any promises in return for a tie-breaking vote against Burr for the presidency. At most, he indicated that certain Federalist views aligned with his own. Anything else would have given him the presidency in return for limiting the executive branch to the conditions of the legislature. And again, this was all done while he was vice president. Number 3. Thomas Jefferson's procedures he developed as vice president were published in 1801 as the Manual of Parliamentary Practice, which very much influenced the working order of the Senate and perhaps more so, the House, among other countless government bodies, private boards, and alike. Number 4. Jefferson's 3 tie-breaking votes in the Senate. Not much to show for 4 years in office, but that leads right into number 5, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Jefferson, through his anonymous resolution, introduced the idea of state nullification of a federal law into the national conversation. This idea would fester and be greatly refined by future Vice President John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. The nullification movement eventually spurned ideas of a Southern secession, at least on a state-by-state level. As wonderful as Jefferson was as president in growing and strengthening the Union, as vice president, he dropped a number of sour seeds into some fertile soil. Anywho, tune in next time to find out how we broke the electoral tie, sending Jefferson to the White House and Aaron Burr to the position of vice president.